again. Here we are, an evening with Dr. Todd Love talking about the intersection sort of ADHD and addiction. Right. And so I am going to sort of get out of your way a little bit and turn my screen off. And can you share your screen?
I believe it will let me, yes.
Peachy.
So I will start that in just a second. Welcome,
Aloyda. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Okay, so I'm gonna just, so the focus is on you.
Me?
Yes, now? And I'm gonna pin you.
Okay. So, hi there. So, yeah, since you had mentioned my background, I'll do a quick, blurb about it. So I'm in my third career, got a ridiculous amount of initials. Sometimes using longer intro, I'll just do the short one. First career, 15 years in corporate IT. That's where my background in internet-related things comes from. Second career, I was a criminal defense attorney, mostly DUI defense. Not too long in that one, I realized I felt better about myself if I didn't take the client's check to help them get away with their second, and instead we sat and talked for 2 hours and they went up for treatment, changed their life. So at some point, one of my colleagues made the joking statement, "You should be the therapist and not the lawyer." So that's it. That's where my passion is. So that's how I went from that back to school, went to night school, and did my dissertation on internet addiction. So that's a real strong area of mine. Today, I'm still licensed as an attorney, also as a professional counselor, and I'm a board certified coach. I have a men's only counseling and coaching private practice, physically located in Athens, Georgia, but that seems to be moot these days. I'm all online, work with people all over the place. Yeah, so I'm going to switch to some presentation slides that I use for, And I took out my disclaimer slide. I usually put that in as kind of a joking but serious thing, and that is, I want to say to the world, I'm very ADHD. And so what that means here is I talk fast, I jump around, I can trail off. So I have prepared on my slide notes, a script. So if it looks like I'm reading, it's because that's how I keep myself on track from going off and all that. So I've got lots of good stuff to say, so bear with me if my ADD mind does what ADD minds do. So if that's fair to say, I am going to, let's see here, share my PowerPoint. I think that is sharing. And now if I do this, are we seeing the presentation?
So everything looks good.
It looks good, okay. Yeah. And I just realized I don't have my notes to be reading. What's the point of that?
Okay. Well, better sound, by the way. That's good.
This is better sound?
Yes.
Much better.
Better microphone. Cool. Okay. So the question, what is ADHD? From one perspective, it's simplified, involves impulsivity, inability to delay gratification, novelty seeking, inattention, executive function, things such as that. So then let me get back to my slide here. Sorry, I'm figuring out this dual computer monitor thing. Okay. Yeah. Is it not showing? There we go. What is ADHD? What is addiction? It's pretty much the same slide. So what is the connection between ADHD and addiction? Break it down into two categories. Physiological ADHD brain has an inherent neurobiological predisposition, more likely to respond positively to addictive stimuli. Impulse control issues, poor judgment can come from executive function, craving novelty. On the psychological side, we can be curious, more likely to experiment, self-medicating. Anxiety, we're very boredom prone, easy to stress. And so, yeah. So I'm gonna jump right into physiology, more into physiology for a couple minutes, the neurobiology of both ADHD and addiction. If anyone's just been to seen any of my conference presentations, I do keep them on my website. You might recognize these slides. I tried to take out some of the dense ones because they're, of various interests to various parties. So this is the first of a few technical slides. I'm not going to try to explain most of it. I can't explain, a lot of it. There's a brain, there's different areas and all that stuff. I think that's sufficiently scientific explanation. That's my joking piece. Let's see here. I'm having trouble getting this, my presenter view to work here. So one more moment. Oh. You see the changes. This is me narrating my interior experience. So I hope everybody's enjoying that. Okay. So anyway, but the serious part about the slide is the purple lines marked by red arrows. These are the two area pathways we're going to talk about. It's what you hear referred to as the reward network. I'll explain more in just a second, but for now, be aware that in the neurotypical brain, this system is pretty well balanced. In the ADHD brain, however, this is one of the areas where the prefrontal cortex naturally can't always muster up enough juice to maintain control of the excitable ADHD brain. So let's look at addiction neurobiology. It may look the same because it is a copy paste of the same slide. So, the addiction, one of these ADHD areas is the same area that's impaired for an addiction. So that's interesting. So the two pathways combined, a big fancy name, the mesocortical limbic dopamine system or network. The mesolimbic pathway is in the more primitive mammalian brain. It's associated with emotions, reward, impulsivity, pleasure, motivation, and all that. The mesocortical pathway connects down from the cortex to the midbrain circuit, and it's associated with cognitive and executive functions such as impulse control, attention, maintenance of goal-directed behavior. Key point of this pathway is to exert and maintain control over the emotional and excitable mesolimbic system. So these two circuits are closely connected such that disruptions in one under functioning, they regulate. In active addiction, the mesolimbic pathway, the midbrain, gets all jacked up, becomes substantially more powerful than the connection to the cortex. Brain scans show that the downward connection essentially can gray out temporarily when someone is in an addiction state. And that is very similar to scans they show of the ADHD brain. The cortex can't go down. That's for impulse control problems. We get all excited about something in that part of the brain, and the cortex isn't able to say, wait, maybe step back and think about that. Instead, we just go and do it. So, didn't know where to put these next three slides, so I just jammed them in here. So I'll talk real quick. The world's three most widely used psychoactive drugs are caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. Researchers have found that adolescents with ADHD were nearly twice as likely to use excessive caffeine than were other adolescents without ADHD. Why is that? This is from a study looking in the therapeutic use of caffeine for ADHD. And they're saying the potential for caffeine treatment to normalize attention and cognitive changes characteristic of ADHD. Anybody with ADHD already knows this, that we can self-medicate with stimulants such as caffeine. But the science, I guess, shows that it improves attention deficit in different areas and all that stuff. So I'll jump to the next one. Nicotine, which is interesting. They've been, and I'm just going to skip some of the stuff I normally say. And other than like caffeine, nicotine can help normalize some of that neurobiological changes. They're looking at some of the nicotinic agents to be future ADHD treatments. I don't know if anything would ever come of that, but it's interesting that, some of the caffeine stuff, even some of the nicotine, I'm not advising anybody should go and take up nicotine to manage their ADHD. That's a horrible idea. So this last one is cannabis. And so researchers have shown that probably 53% of non-daily users and 57% of daily users met criteria for ADHD. There's a self-medication theory that cannabis improves ADHD or it's therapeutic for ADHD. However, studies aren't necessarily finding this. Instead, they're finding the relationship to possibly be an incorrect perception or an overgeneralization. For example, a recent study using data from this long-term study of ADHD people, there's the perception that cannabis use improves mood. In their conclusion, they stated future studies should also differentiate between the perception that this is working and the actually improving ADHD symptoms. And this sample seems to conflate the two. So, well, may be valid that cannabis has an anxiolytic effect, an anxiety reducing effect. And some studies have found it's effective for managing poor tolerance to frustration, boredom, and all this stuff. Contrast, mountains of studies show that it increases executive function problems. And I'm not here to be like anti-cannabis and all this. I don't know why I'm going so deep into this slide, but I think it's interesting and relevant. So because I guess a lot of people talk about using it to medicate the ADHD. The paradox is that it furthers, again, executive function problems, decreases motivation. We have trouble, all kinds of stuff, which increases anxiety. ADHD symptoms, people feel more need to self-medicate, so they go, and so it can create this paradox, this loop. And so it's not a helpful tool for management of ADHD. Finally, I'll speak super briefly to CBD. Super briefly, just to say that there isn't a sufficient body of scientific evidence to support the use of CBD for ADHD. Lots of people have their anecdotal experience to share, but in the scientific literature, as of recent checking, there's nothing saying, do so. So I have nothing positive or negative to say about it. I figured somebody would bring up CBD, so I just preemptively adding it on there. Okay, talking fast, moving forward. 3 myths about ADHD and addiction. Some common myths. 1, stimulant medication treatment of ADHD in childhood can lead to addiction later in life. Long-term use of stimulant meds will lead to addiction, and people with ADHD will abuse their stimulant medication. All of these are incorrect. The first myth, that childhood stimulant use leads to addiction. The truth is that stimulant medication of ADHD in childhood actually doesn't lead to addiction later in life. Study after study after study finds this. There's no compelling evidence. In fact, they found the opposite, that it can reduce the risk for developing an addiction, what they call a protective effect. Treating ADHD lowers impulsivity, increases judgment, kids fit in better, have less problems, and so they're less likely to turn to addictive behaviors. And one study found medications were associated with an 85% reduction in risk of kids growing up to be addicts or alcoholics. So and I'm going to skip some of the details of that. Greatest risk is not properly treating childhood ADHD, as opposed to staying away from medications because you think it's going to make your kids addicts. It's not the audience we're talking to, but this is on some of the slides, and I think it's interesting because some people actually still have a kind of perspective. I'm not an MD, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not paid by pharma, so I'm not pushing anything. I'm just kind of reporting what I have found in the scientific literature and what clients have come to talk to me about. So, second one is, second myth, long-term stimulant use does not lead to addiction. This is not the myth, this is the truth. The neurotypical brain is not the same as the ADHD brain. So it's that paradoxical effect of ADHD medications. For me, I take my med in the morning and it calms me down. So it doesn't act like it. So anyway, so they found it's not associated with that. The third myth, that ADHD people abuse their stimulant meds, that is not true. Again, the neurotypical brain is not the ADHD brain. If I double my dose, I don't get high. I have Starbucks syndrome, zombie mode. ADHD people might know all this stuff. If your dose is too high, it's not fun. Where people that have a neurotypical brain, they take it, they may have whatever there. So yes, so I've got a lot of other things on this slide, but I will, for the sake of time, just keep moving forward. 3 myths about addiction treatment for people with ADHD. 1 is addiction centers think they don't need to screen for it. 2, people with ADHD, you have to stop taking your meds if you want to get sober for addiction problems. And 3, people with ADHD and a history of substance abuse will be unable to safely resume their medication to manage their symptoms after they become sober. And that's false, false, and false. So really, ADHD treatment programs must screen for ADHD. So there's just a huge what is it? Is the statistic on this slide? Huge percentage of people that go into rehab centers have undiagnosed ADHD. That's just kind of the bottom line. I don't need my script to tell me that. What is it? 50+% of people. So it really, they need to be screened and you need to treat it. And all the International Consensus Statement on Screening, Treating, Diagnosis of Substance Use Disorder Patients. And they all say that treatment-seeking drug and addiction patients should be screened for and treated for ADHD, And part B of this part of the myth is stimulant medication is actually helpful for people with addiction treatment. So it's useful in reducing ADHD symptoms without worsening the addiction. And so, yeah. So, okay, what am I doing? Talking fast, moving along. ADHD people can benefit from continuing medications if they choose to go into addiction treatment. So I'll put these slides up on my website so people that are interested in these details don't have to try to retain this as I talk fast. I know there's a time window and I've got a lot of slides and I want to be able to have any dialogue that we want. So that's why I'm just kind of going along. And along the last one, the truth is long-term use of ADHD medication supports long-term addiction recovery. So people that are that are gotten sober, all the studies say, take your meds. It helps keep you, centered. You're getting all your stuff done. You're living a more successful life, less likely to fall back into relapse and addiction patterns. So, yeah. Summary, ADHD and addiction. Many similarities between the brain of someone with ADHD and the brain of someone struggling with addiction. 50% of people, struggling with ADHD, with addiction also have ADHD. Stimulant medication treatment for ADHD and all the way back to childhood does not lead to addiction. Medications offer a protective effect, and childhood ADHD treatment equals addiction prevention. And so, yes. So addiction treatment and recovery, it really needs to be screened for if people are going to a treatment program. Medications are a pro-recovery choice. And yeah, there are many similarities between addiction recovery and ADHD management. Self-care, lifestyle factors, stress management, structure, and daily routine. This is something that we would talk to anybody coming out of a treatment center, and we would talk to somebody in an ADHD coaching thing. So interestingly enough. Okay, go quick into this. Behavioral addictions. Historically, the concept of addiction has been reserved in people's minds for the ingestion of drugs and alcohol. However, in 2011, the American Society for Addiction Medicine confidently declared that addiction is one condition, whether it's alcohol, cocaine, internet use, gambling, or sex. Note that it's particularly important to understand that when discussing addictions not involving chemical ingestion, from the neuroscience perspective, addiction is more about reward than pleasure. They used to think of that mesolimbic dopamine center as the pleasure center of the brain. Now they realize it's the reward center, or more specifically, it's the anticipation of reward. And that ties in with the ADHD factor. So quick note, tolerance and withdrawal. It's important to understand this in order to kind of accept the, the idea that behaviors can be addictive. People may say, who goes into withdrawal from being online too much? They're confusing withdrawal with detox. Yes, from chemicals, there's a detox process depending on use, but that is different than withdrawal. Withdrawal is a negative mood state. And so people, struggling with internet addiction, all these symptoms are things that come out, and it's the same thing with any addiction, right? Somebody stops drinking, and for the first however long, all these kinds of things, and that's part of a shared withdrawal. So some addictive behaviors, broke them into three categories: kind of lifestyle related, gambling, shopping, sex addiction stuff; technology related, internet related addictions, social networking, Facebook, Instagram, smartphone, and yeah. So it's interesting, multiple diagnostic tests have been developed for internet addiction, Facebook addiction, social networking, and they've been tested, retested, validating into multiple languages. So it's a huge area of investigation. Not as much here in the US, but I'll get to that later. And then third one is food related. Multiple studies have shown that rats prefer sugary and fatty foods to addictive drugs, as most humans do. When both rats and humans binge to obesity, their brains change in ways that mimic drug addiction. That's why the problem of binge eating is currently under heavy research by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. We're turning out study after study showing reward circuitry overactivation involved with binge eating. And some of these studies are overlapping with ADHD. So ADHD and binge eating and all that stuff, because again, it's all that same area that gets involved with. So gambling disorder. Let's talk for a minute about that. That's the easiest behavioral addiction for people to get behind. In 2013, it was officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as an addiction. The World Health Organization has done the same thing. And yeah, so gambling disorder and ADHD. I found, this was an older review that I'd done, but I found 23 papers published over the years on the intersection of ADHD and gambling disorder. Extracted some key points from the pile of those studies. For example, it appears that 25% of people with gambling disorder have ADHD. And gamblers with ADHD get the problem earlier, and they struggle harder than people with non-ADHD that also have gambling disorder. Researchers have found that treating the underlying ADHD can help resolve the gambling disorder. That shouldn't be a surprise based on what we've been talking about. And then Yeah, so before I go to the next slide, a few interesting findings from a study from UCLA a few years ago. They're finding gamblers with ADHD were significantly more prone to betting on a sporting event or animal races. And none of the gamblers with ADHD reported problems purchasing lottery tickets. I have no idea why that is. There's something interesting that Rory Reed found, and so I thought I'd put it up there for fun. So, actually, they theorized there's more excitement or novelty for the first than there was for the second. That was his just speculation. Okay, so now we've talked about what addiction is, some of the details behind it, taking the concept beyond chemicals into behaviors such as gambling. Let's talk about the specific problem of the internet-related addictions. It's important to note that while I'm using the term addiction in addiction language, it doesn't mean that everything is an addiction. In fact, researchers are still trying to differentiate between addictive use and problematic use. As with ADHD, addiction diagnosis requires a certain minimum amount of a constellation of symptoms. So just like many people show ADHD-like traits, but that's not enough to actually have an ADHD brain. Same it is with addiction. People can be problematic users, have very unhealthy relationships with, internet-related behaviors, but not actually addiction, but they still have problems. But some people get the brain changes. So I'll go more into that in a little while. Recent a relevant sidebar down an interesting road, the phenomenon of supernormal stimulus. Nobel laureate Nicholas Tinbergen, who years ago, the 50s or whatever, coined the term. In his experiment, he discovered that birds, butterflies, and other animals could be duped into preferring fake eggs or mates. For example, shorebirds would abandon their own smaller eggs to incubate with the much larger, more colorful plaster eggs fabricated by Tinbergen and his research team. Same with butterflies. They would flock to cardboard butterflies with bigger, more colorful wings. So modern junk food is another example of a supernormal stimulus with its never seen before combinations of textures, salt, fats, sugars. The tongue was just not designed to anticipate what happens with that. That's why they call it a supernormal stimuli. So is the excitement by video games, internet porn, streaming internet content, walking into a casino with, just all that stuff. Mind wasn't designed to handle such intensity. So for the first time in human history, we have an endless stream of novelty on the internet. With each click, swipe, Facebook-like, text message, email, cat video, etc., we receive a little squirt of dopamine. Each squirt of dopamine is interpreted by the brain as something that's really important. But in this domain, it usually is not. So, but the brain gets, much of the use is somewhat mimics the rat in the lab pressing the button, condition our brain to think all this is really important, but it's usually not. Rarely are we engaged in any activity on the internet that furthers our survival or the survival of our genes, but that certain parts of the brain don't get that. So going back to the dopamine, people like to talk about these days, or the awareness has really come out about its involvement in all these different areas. Mentioned earlier that addiction neurobiology is now better known as involving the reward circuit rather than the pleasure circuit. Anticipation is the critical element of reward, and searching and seeking keeps dopamine elevated. So I'm now going to repeat a sentence that I used in my last slide. For the first time in human history, we have an endless stream of novelty available on the internet. We have it right there, endless novelty. Could probably sum this entire part of the presentation up, at least conceptually, by linking the novelty needs of the ADHD brain with the endless novelty of the internet. Suppose we know that, that's maybe why we're here in the first place. So, pulling all that together and asking the question, is there an intersection between internet addiction and ADHD? And of course, no surprise that the answer is a yes. So, I'm not going to go through these. And let me see here. So I might have mentioned, or I don't know if I skipped over this part of a prior one, but it's not talked about as much or researched as much in the United States, internet addiction and ADHD, or just internet addiction in general. The rest of the world, in Korea, announced internet addiction as a public health crisis in 2010. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association denied the problem as a medical diagnosis. So we're not connected on that. So I'm going to jump through, but the rest of the world is. So I'm going to jump through a few ginormous slides here just to make the point about how much research is being done on the topic around the world. And let's see here, tons coming out of Southeast Asia. Can't put them on a single slide, so I'll just say research internet addiction in Korea, in Taiwan, in China and Japan, internet addiction in Europe, research unit in Turkey for whatever interesting reason is there. And so looking at ADHD and internet addiction. In the US, there have been some stuff that came out in the last 5 years or so. There might be something newer. I have not updated this slide in a little while, but compared to the rest of the world, we are just really far behind in, oops, my finger goes too fast, in what's out there. So, if it was a longer presentation, I would actually go into some of those studies and pull out, the interesting pieces and whatnot, because it's all relevant to this. For here, I've just kind of crushed it into this smaller thing. What they found is common findings. Approximately 20% of young adults with ADHD also struggle with internet addiction. I think that's low, but often co-occurs with depression and or anxiety. Severity of ADHD symptoms links to the risk for and the severity of an internet type addiction. Again, internet addiction, I skipped over subtypes. Internet gaming disorder, internet pornography addiction is a huge problem that people don't like talking about. That was that little elephant in the room slide earlier, which says ignore me on the side of this giant elephant. Gaming, social media, porn, all that stuff can be addictive. They found that all subtypes of ADHD are vulnerable to internet addiction. Both males and females were equally vulnerable to internet addiction. It's not a guy's problem. It's not a gaming. It's not a boy's problem. The average age of today's gamer is in their 30s, I think. And there's more adult female gamers than there are teenage boy gamers. And so it's equal opportunity thing. I have a whole slide I took away on that. There's an overlap between the ADHD brain wiring and the internet addiction brain wiring, just like the generic addiction brain wiring. And several studies have found ADHD meds can help with internet addiction treatment. Some of the ones in, I think it was Korea, where they were doing people with internet addiction, ADHD, some with having their methylphenidate, some not having their methylphenidate, given the same treatment, in terms of like addiction recovery stuff, who had this higher success rate, people treating their ADHD was helping people getting away from internet addiction. Some of the risk factors include, shouldn't surprise anybody that struggles with ADHD, sensation seeking, thrill seeking, novelty, frustration intolerance, boredom aversion. So 3 myths about ADHD and internet related addictions. The first one, too much internet use causes ADHD. That's wrong. It's impossible. ADHD is pre-wired in the brain, right? So A can lead to B. Being ADHD can lead to an internet addiction, but having an internet addiction cannot reverse engineer the brain into having ADHD. Symptoms can be very similar. Someone who is just, has no more patience, infinite scroll and all that stuff it can mimic, but that's not an ADHD brain. Second myth, ADHD males have more problems with internet addiction than females. I think I mentioned that. They're equally vulnerable. And third, it's a child adolescent problem, not a problem for adults. And they found that, that's not correct. Okay, I'll pause, take a drink, my throat's sore, talk fast. The big question, what to do about it, right? So remember, it's, just want to reinforce, said earlier, not all out of control internet use means we have an internet addiction. Doesn't mean it's still a problem. I'm using the addiction language, but technically for some people it might just be problematic use. It really doesn't matter. If it's having a problematic footprint in my life, if it's causing consequences, if I'm trying to shake it and it's not going away, whatever the name is, it's a problem. So, some tech solutions, protecting yourself from yourself. In my practice, I work with a lot of people struggling with an actual internet addiction, gaming, porn, or 2 really common ones I mentioned. With either case, I think it's good to start with the notion of when you treat the person, you must also treat their environment. We would do this, with an AA client, with anything. Applies to people with ADHD in general. In today's world, with high-speed internet access just available everywhere, escapist content accessible virtually all the time, many of us just need safe environments where the ease of access to such content is made a little bit less easier. Anybody who's familiar with the marshmallow test, studying the impulse control and inability to delay gratification, where they told young kids, you can have this one marshmallow now, or if you wait a couple minutes while I leave the room, you can have two. And then the monitor would leave the room. Some kids would patiently wait, like my wife would just, we were both doing this. She'd be the one that would just patiently wait, and I'd be the one as soon as they were gone, and then they tracked them over time and found that kids that scarfed up the marshmallow immediately were more likely to have future diagnoses like ADHD or, addiction problems. And it's because that, inability to delay gratification, jumping into, seeking and all that kind of stuff. Back to tech solutions. Nobody would expect somebody with a drinking problem to get sober while still carrying around a bottle of Jack in their pocket. You can carry this many bottles, a little fifth, that's fine. You can pull it out, look at it a lot, sniff it. You just don't drink it. That's an absurd notion. Nobody would say that. But if somebody is struggling with compulsive, addictive internet use, or an ADHD person is trying to temper their use, the smartphone's right there. All I have to do is type in whatever site or download the game, and it's right back there. So people go through these cycles of very well-intentioned, but then falling back into it. Very well-intentioned, falling back into it. So the protecting yourself from yourself is there's a lot of technology solutions where you can turn these devices into safe, productive tools and not nightmares of distraction. So make it clear, I'm not endorsing any specific products. I'll just list a few of the relevant ones that I know about. I'm sure there's more that are just as great and that are out there. Some of the time tracking programs, I think, are helpful because sometimes we don't realize how much of a problem it is. And so Rescue Time is a program I learned about, I think, through Chad. And I really like it. It's an app, you install it on the computer. The Apple now has screen time, the iOS devices, I think they put it in the Mac OS. Google has something they were calling digital well-being. I don't know if it's still on the Android or if they renamed it or whatever, but it just constantly logs where you're going, how you're spending your time, and then it presents you a report at the end of the week or the beginning of the next week with, where is all your time going? And it can be really helpful for people to realize, because ADHD people can be time blind in general. Wow, I spend 2 hours a day on social networking. I thought I was just flipping through. So collecting that data is helpful, and those are programs that are helpful for that. Tools such as Screen Time and Rescue Time help us get some insight into where our time is going, but what do we do with that information? This is where programs like Freedom and Focus Me can come into play. Freedom is a website and app blocker that can be set to run at certain times and block certain things. It can be set manually or recurring. For example, during office hours, for myself, I have categories news, sports, shopping, stuff like that, just blocked from my home computer. So if I get an unexpected, a session gets canceled, I want to just distract myself. It's like, nope, I can't do it. So I might as well catch up on my billing paperwork. It's just that little nudge into the right direction. If I've taken away that distraction, then I've protected myself from myself, kind of a thing. Focus Me, I believe, is a similar program, just not use that one. So, and then there's content filtering and use management. That would be the next level of strength. So you can just do a full lockdown of devices. You can do it on a whole house basis with a physical device like Circle. OpenDNS, you can configure it into a router. Because asking people with even just ADHD people in general to exercise willpower, I got a reaction in my stomach just to that word. It's been weaponized against ADHD people so much. Just be more disciplined. Don't go to those websites. Just use your willpower. I'm not going to hold up my shoot a bird hand, but that's what I usually do in my mind when I hear that phrase, because it's difficult. And so things that can help protect us from stuff that I just, it's not helpful for me, they're great tools. So there's per device solutions, MobiSip, Questito, I think. And there's a lot of these programs are focused as parental controls, and so you have to set up a child account and all this stuff. And it's kind of demeaning for an adult. I'm sitting there, an ADHD coaching client with a 50-year-old guy. Like, I know you have to call it and download a child account, but it's really helpful because it is. So people that go that route, just be prepared for that. Don't get your feelings hurt. It's just how it is. Covenant Eyes is one that's dedicated or directed towards porn, and it uses adult language. It assumes that adult is deciding to make this change and all that stuff. But the other ones are called Parental Controls, and So as my final slide, okay, I got them quickly. Throw out some language that was first used, proposed by Dr. Kimberly Young, the original author on the topic of internet addiction, all the way back in 1999. And digital diet and digital nutrition. I really like that. Digital diet, keeping a log to control and monitor how much we're consuming. You know, what we're very aware, or we try to be aware of what we're putting in our body, but how is that much different than the junk that I'm putting through my eyes into my brain? And it's just worse in recent years with all the different things, fake news, just hate and all this stuff. And there's just so much junk and clickbait and games and porn and all this stuff. And I'm not against anything, by the way. It's just overwhelming. Some people don't react well to it. Some people become addicted to other things. So digital nutrition, making better choices about what to consume, learning to choose between healthy and unhealthy internet content, I think is a great metaphor. I don't know why these two phrases haven't been really popularized, because I think she did really well with those. Wow, I took faster than I thought I did. So there we go. I'm now going to see if I can make it stop the share. And I'm just going to end that, and then that'll stop the share, I do believe. Why won't it let me do that? There we go. Cancel, stop share, ta-da. Okay.
All right, wow, that was just a monstrous amount of information. We had some nice banter in the chat. Are there people with any questions for Dr. Love, for Todd? And in the absence of that, I am happy to have a kind of a conversation that will also act as a, you know, put some more information out there. Okay, so let's see. I'll just have the two of us talking. So there were a lot of things that you said, and there was a lot of interesting in the chat. There was one thing that I've hinted at every time I've told people that we were going to have you here, which is the boredom for ADHDers. You made a very big impression on me when we first talked about this, which I can't even remember how long ago it was, that boredom might be painful for ADHD.
I need to go and find what that study or those studies are. I don't know if it was Dr. Barkley or somebody, or Hallowell, you know, initially is where I heard it from, or they've done some of the neuroscience, you know, fMRI studies or EEG or both, and they found that boredom for an ADHD person can register in overlapping areas with anxiety or even pain. And so it is, you know, literally harder for, or it's truly harder for us to sit with boredom than the neurotypical brain, because it overlaps with some stuff that is just, we are more uncomfortable with it, which makes us more prone to jump into something that to get us out of it. So lead to self-medicating and all that. But yeah, I thought that was fascinating to see that there's actual, you know, neuroscience supporting the fact that boredom is harder for us. It just hurts almost. Of course, things like mindfulness and all that help manage that. But yes, and I thought that was interesting too.
There was a question in the chat that I wanted to circle back around. See if I can find it. Sorry. It's sort of that lottery tickets versus versus the events with races with that one's just wasn't quite as stimulating. That was an interesting conclusion. Someone mentioned Vivas as a medication that is sometimes used to treat binge eating. Have you heard that?
I have not heard that. That's interesting. You know, we know a lot of people have a side effect from the stimulant medications of feeling like their appetite is suppressed, or another little interesting tidbit. I think Dr. Dodson had said it in the Atlanta conference, whatever, irrelevant detail, that, you know, technically the stimulant meds don't suppress the appetite. Instead, it activates the satiation message. So the body thinks it's full, so we don't think to eat. But apparently that's different in the brain than having the appetite suppressed. Effectively, it's the same thing, but I thought it was really neat when he said that. I'm like, wow, that's kind of a cool little tidbit. But yeah, so it wouldn't surprise me. And I don't know if there's studies saying this is what they recommend doing, but using something that is kind of, you know, suppresses appetite to help, you know, with people that are having binge eating issues. So it's curious.
I have a question, Melissa and Dr.
Please.
Love. I hear a lot of people, myself included, I'm curious, and maybe I missed this in the beginning, where that dividing line is between doing something a lot and actually being addicted to it. And I don't have an alcohol issue myself, but I've heard people who I just know have an alcohol problem. They say, oh no, I can quit anytime. I don't really have a problem. I can see it's interfering with their life, but they don't. So how would a person kind of self-assess whether or not they're just doing something a lot? And I drink water every day. I don't feel like I'm addicted to it. It's not hurting my life. How would they differentiate between that and something that is actually harming them and they should do something about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you kind of had the answer to it, in the second part of what you're saying. It's not harming my life. So I think that's the line, is they're talking about consequences, big C or little c. A big C consequence, someone gets a DUI. Little c consequence, they realize, this is just I need to stop. But so if somebody, I've heard of people who have lost their job, or a teacher that lost their job because they just could not check their social media during the school hours, even though they were told not to do it and they know not to do it. Everybody wants to kind of do it. But what if somebody posted this thing? Someone who's just unable to say no to that urge, and then they start getting life consequences. That's where it's crossed the line in the brain. In terms of those networks early on, the cortex is not able to talk down and say, hey man, hold on, let's wait, let's do this later. That mid part of the brain is like, we're gonna do it, we've got to do it, and we do it.
So one other thing, and then I'll turn it back to Melissa, but I'm curious where you mentioned boredom, and I remember in my early days of discovery about ADHD, I basically said, quite believing it, I said, I never get bored. I don't remember being bored ever. But what I realized, I think it's along with what you were saying, is I would get anxious whenever that boredom feeling began to come up, and I'd rush out and do something. And it probably wasn't what I needed to be doing at that moment. I would rush out and do something else. So I was self-medicating to get rid of the boredom. So I don't know if I would call it painful, but I agree with what you were saying, at least in my case. I don't get bored because I don't allow myself to.
It's interesting. And and retooling that into, healthy, productive behaviors, keeping myself, that's great. It's when that boredom is, the fire under me and I just jumping into impulsive stuff or escaping, then that's where, so that same thing could launch in one of two directions, productive or problematic or catastrophic. People that get addiction.
And it does. As often as once in a while it turns into something good, but usually I'm doing something that I am bored with, like let's just say writing a blog, and I get really anxious, and so I rush out and do something else which you may have some productive value, but it wasn't the thing I thought I should be doing.
Have you heard the procrastivity term yet?
Yes, I have.
I love that one. I learned that one, in their thing. So that's the choosing to do a lower order item at the expense of a higher order thing. So we're writing the blog and I'm going to go do this thing instead. And technically it's productive, but it's really putting off the thing that's boring or more difficult. So I thought that was a great term.
Oh yeah, I have really clean dishes when I am faced with something I don't want to do.
Exactly, right.
So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand. We'll get you unmuted before we run out of time here.
Okay, I see another question in the question and answer, which is, although major democracies are recognizing internet addiction, are they also reducing stigma and veering away from ADHD diagnosis, such as France having an abysmally low diagnosis rate? Well, because they don't even seem to think ADD is real for adults in France. So are major democracies, are those countries that are studying the internet addiction, are they doing other things around it? Just if you know.
Yeah, I do not know. That's a question for the group. I'd be curious if other people know that. I have not looked into that, so I don't have it. Yeah, it's very curious. Good question.
And I noticed in the chat, we had a person saying that they usually listen to a meeting. They can't be at a meeting or work without doing some other kind of mindless activity like doodling or playing a game. And I do find myself, a little solitaire while I'm listening to a television program. So double-fisted screens, so to speak.
Right.
Is that in this same realm?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And that's where everybody, people can say, oh, we've all, and I think lots of ADHD-like symptoms, but not ADHD brains, have just been, created with this instant on culture and the ability to, never thought that I could get bored watching a movie. But now we're so used to, oh, this is a boring scene, 10 seconds skip, 10 seconds skip, let me check my email. It's ridiculous. 10 years ago, it's like, how could I get bored? I like watching movies, or, so multi-screening and all that stuff. And I think it's just so widely common, but I think we probably are more quick to it and have a harder time getting out of it. So, yeah.
So the two things at once, that is another sort of a boredom avoidance thing.
Yeah.
Or is it a good strategy for some ADHDers to be doing doodling or some other task so that they can engage listening?
Yeah, when I talk with coaching clients and all that, we're talking about taking a non-cognitive break, like with the Pomodoro stuff, on your break, make it non-cognitive. Or if it's a second task, like the fidget spinners people talking about, or doodling or whatever, I think that's good. If I'm trying to check my email while watching this movie, once I check my email, I've just pushed out some of the nuances of the plot and now pulled in this thing, it's a cognitive type of thing. Checking the news while I'm trying to, go through my email, those two things conflict. I think for most brains, and for our brains with or my working memory, like that, it's one or the other, and I'm trying to do both, and I stink at both because of that in the moment.
Did you say stink at both things?
When I'm trying to do both, I stink at both, right? So I have to do one or the other, and I try to, so.
Is this the multitasking myth being
that is
held right in front of
myth
us?
Back in the 80s, it was like this big thing, multitasking, and now the research psychologists have found kind of like there's a pie chart of how much cognitive function we have in the brain, and the more we're doing at once, the smaller the pieces become. So the pie doesn't get bigger when we do more things. It just, the quality that we're tending to just goes down and down.
Again, boom, just a lot of stuff. So you talked about a lot of different behaviors, right? There was the stuff with our phone that was like hey, 5 bottles of Jack Daniels, you're just going to smell it, you're not going to have it. I really love that metaphor. Really spoke to me. I remember early on when we had met, there was a group of people who were talking about problematic internet use or problematic mobile device use, and that people were taking apps off their phone. That was one of those strategies that you had shown. So like, I never put certain things on my phone, like I did, Facebook, not on my phone. And so there's other strategies. Sometimes people have a work computer, they only do work on that computer, then they have a play computer, then they can look at adult content, but not, be worried about getting in trouble, or however they're going to manage it. So there was a lot of different ways that you talked about managing it. Parental controls, the apps. I just remembered hearing things about taking the apps off your phone that were kind of news to me, because I wasn't using my phone nearly as well as other people. Like, I just didn't use it for surfing. I'd come sit in front of my big box for that. Are there other strategies around that you've heard?
Yeah, I have a process I go through with some clients, and so we take out the phone and list out all the different apps that you have. Which ones do we need to keep? And so I need my dual factor authentication, my maps, my email, my this, my that. Do I need the, certain things, like, do I need news apps? That's questionable. Do I need to be able to search the web on my phone? It's questionable. Do I need games? No. Do I need, this, that? No. So decide what really needs to be kept, what definitely don't need to, and then kind of negotiate in a healthy way, the middle. And then you can lock the phone, so you can block access to the App Store in the iOS, just give someone else a screen time password. So then the person, the impulsive ADHD person, is left with this really productive, device. So my calendaring, my scheduling, all my thing is on there, and I can't then switch over to Instagram and TikTok and lose 2 hours. all I can do is the stuff that I've decided in a productive, healthy conversation that this is what I think is good for me and not good for me. So things like that is, it's a model that I use, and I think it's just really helpful.
It does sound really helpful. There was something about a diet, like an electronic diet
Digital diet.
you had
right?
in there. And I see other people who are talking about wellness habits, about, trying to keep ourselves from overdosing on news or negative things. Like,
Mhm.
remember the beginning of the pandemic, you just thought, I need to know everything that's known. And you kind of was just like
That
a fire hose of information, and too much and hard to stay calm. So is there any other things around this diet, that you have thoughts around?
I don't have a specific model for a diet. I just like that concept, and I guess my mind was about to say, people need to decide that individually, which I guess is true. But I think there's also some, very common ones. Things like news is just so problematic these days. We want to stay connected and informed and all that stuff, but being able to constantly scroll turns into doom scrolling or escape or whatever. So whatever happened to the the beginning of the day, I'm going to sit and read the whatever, news thing and, get caught up, as opposed to just constantly checking. But, the 24-hour news cycle that came out with CNN in the 80s has now been replaced by the just constant on our phone. And that's where it goes from, I'm informed, to I'm now having an escapist problem and it's impacting my life negatively.
I mostly tell all the things that I don't want them to tell me anything. But every so often I'll have a news, like I put the New York Times on the phone, and it's like, did I really need to be distracted away from whatever I was thinking about to know that little tidbit that you thought was important, New York Times?
Right.
So the turning off the notifications, I found that to be very, very useful.
Brittany Smith does a great presentation at the conferences about making tech work for you. So we're kind of not two sides of a coin, but she was talking about, all the ways that, phones are problematic, the dings, the notifications, the little red bubbles and all that, but you turn all that off, you tweet, then do what I was saying, getting rid of the apps. These are ways that you can use them to totally bolster your ADHD, scaffolding. And so, yeah.
I think one of the more interesting myths that you tackle is that idea that more men are playing games, or more younger men are having gaming addiction, and that the gaming seems like it's both genders are playing games on their phone, right? Yeah, that was really, that feels eye-opening to me.
Esports is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So, what was it a few years ago? The League of Legends World Championship had a little bit less viewers. I can never remember the size. Had less viewers than the Super Bowl, but more viewers than the what was it? The Final Four, I think. So it was a serious. It was up there with the top sporting events. People are just, it's not a kid's thing anymore. It's very mainstreamed.
So I noticed that this was a presentation from when you spoke at the conference, and it seemed to me like this was an area of exploration for you. Maybe because of the people who are your clients. Is there some other area of exploration that's of interest to you these days?
Not a new frontier. I'm trying to think if there's a new frontier that I've been looking at. No, I guess it's my focus in recent years. I've stopped doing much academic stuff. I was never an academic, never doing formal research studies, but I try to keep up and compile and do lit reviews and put it all out there. As you saw in this, my review is a few years behind. There's probably a couple, more studies that have come out that I can put in there. I've just been so clinically focused, I guess. And adding the coaching part to my clinical practice, that's really opened the door to work, in a different kind of way, and helping people get to quicker solutions rather than a longer term therapy thing. So I guess that's where my focus has been, that part of my time that I was doing more.
Well, that begs a question, which is, what speeds the plow? Is it a mindset thing?
Re-ask that question.
what speeds the plow? What helps us get from the idea of I'd like to have this new habit or better habit to instituting it, to actually having it? Or is that where is that what you
Yeah,
were
I think that's its own, series of conversations, right? And there's probably people that are more expert than I am on that,
just
But
asking?
yeah, for finding what motivates each individual, right? And then finding a way to make it interesting, finding out where does it become overwhelming in advance, so we can then change it, so I don't go down that, escapism, flee when I get overwhelmed with something, and keeping it, just iterative process, moving forward.
So we have a really fantastic comment. I just want to make sure that I read before we close, which is, this talk was helpful, especially around the treatment of ADHD and those that have addictions. That's a very hot topic in psychiatry. And I will second that Todd's ahead of the curve on this conversation topic about if you were in treatment in a place, right, for addictions, that they wouldn't necessarily, you may not be able to get your ADD medicine, which makes it all the harder to manage the other thing that you're trying to work on.
Right. If I were to have a new patent, I don't know, not that I'm old, whatever that means, but if I was 10, 15 years younger in my career and was looking for something to really jump with, I think, one of two areas: educating addiction treatment centers, getting those rules taken down that, oh, you can't take Adderall while you're in recovery. So instead, these people have to sit in group rooms, fidgety and restless and all that all day, every day. No, that needs to change. And then just prescribers. Again, I'm not a prescriber. I've not been to med school, but I try to keep up with all this. And when a prescriber says, oh, you used to smoke a lot of pot, well, we're not going to be able to give you Vivas because that's an addictive drug and you'll get addicted to that. I wanted to keep a blog of all the ridiculous statements that I've heard, medical prescribers tell my clients. And then I try to educate them and encourage them to go back and provide a different perspective. It's just, so just fundamentally wrong. Just the use of meds, and certainly meds when it involves with, hey, I'm trying to stop being a compulsive gamer and all this stuff. And why would, yeah. So those are two passion areas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this specific arena with these sorts of things, but then, I mean, I've talked to adult women looking to get diagnosed, and the prescriber, right, the MD will say, oh, well, how did you do in school? Oh, I was an honor student. Well, then you can't have ADD.
Oh, right. Yep.
So the world needs more Todd Love. That's what I'm going to say.
The world needs more all of us, everybody here.
Indeed. And then I cannot recall which medication, but I had been in a peer group that was people around 30, and they were, I don't know if it was Vivas, but there was something like, oh yeah, I really liked smoking on that when I was taking that. And as soon as I stopped taking that, I didn't have an interest in smoking cigarettes. So it was nicotine. And I thought, wow, I wish there was a researcher in the room who wanted to make his name.
Right. Yeah, I don't know about that. That's interesting.
So let's do a couple more housekeeping things here. Let's do this. Pardon me. All right. So the next thing that's coming for this series is Ryan Mayer next week, and he's going to be talking to us about accountability. So there's a plug for that. And as usual, on Mondays, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, we have the Success Clinic, a place where you can come and speak about your feelings, any other things. No recording is being made. All right, that was my housekeeping. Thanks, Todd Love. I put Todd's email, not his email, his website in the chat. I know people are interested in Doc Anderson's being posted. I will find that out and put a note on the Mighty Networks area. And without further ado, let's do this.